Hey everyone, so we're looking to round off our Anthem coverage for now by concentrating on the PlayStation 4 builds of the game, which offer, for my money, possibly the best ways to play on the base and enhanced consoles. Now this is hardly news, of course. That was the conclusion that Digital Foundry came to when we looked at the demo builds right back at the beginning of the month. However, the Anthem landscape has changed significantly in the meanwhile, and there is a closer degree of parity now between Xbox and PlayStation builds, certainly in terms of the enhanced consoles. Xbox One X runs more smoothly than it did during the demo period, and while this may prove controversial to some, the PlayStation versions now deliver the same capped 30 frames per second as their Microsoft counterparts did when we first actually saw console code. So that means there's good news and bad news here, depending on your perspective. Looking at the standard PlayStation 4 version of the game, during the demo phase we found frame rates to be mostly in 30 frames per second territory, but that performance level was unlocked. You didn't really gain any extra performance. All you did get was lots of unnecessary judder, almost like improper frame pacing. We'll be looking more closely at performance a bit later, but right now it's safe to say that the base PS4 presents significantly more smoothly than it did previously, so I would say that this is a bit of a win. However, PS4 Pro, now this allowed for two modes, a 4K output mode along with a native 1080p option, and this allowed for performance to run unchecked at anything between 35 to 60 frames per second. Anthem still has those two options, and they're both accessed in the same way for Pro users. But the bottom line is that if you liked running the game at 1080p unlocked, that particular avenue has now been closed off. 30 frames per second is indeed enforced across the board, across all versions of Anthem on PlayStation 4 consoles. On the plus side at least though, the cap does help to reduce some of the kind of wobbliness inherent in the 4K output mode as it presented during the demo phase. And so by extension, the final code does have more feeling of refinement, consistency now. I'd like to share some notes before we go into more in-depth performance analysis, as a big patch did drop over the weekend. The flow of the game seems unchanged, and I didn't see much in the way of frame rate improvements from one version to the next. However, the HDR support that mysteriously disappeared on all platforms when the day one patch arrived has now been restored. And you know what? There is the real sense that Anthem is improving with each patch, and the game is certainly a lot more stable now. If not from a performance standpoint, then certainly in terms of bugs. I mean, look, there are still issues, let's be clear about that, and this is just one example I came up with. We sort of entered the overworld here to see additional ground detail flickering in and out of existence, which obviously isn't right. I also want to take this opportunity to return to some Xbox One X versus PS4 Pro comparisons. With final code, we now have the means to look at the game across a range of content and draw some further conclusions. To begin with, dynamic resolution is indeed confirmed across all systems, and in terms of the enhanced consoles, they're able to draw upon varying resolutions from 80% on the horizontal and vertical up to full 4K. PS4 Pro is likely drawing upon checkerboard rendering here, but I've got to say that Frostbite's implementation here is outstanding, with the only variation only really evident when zooming up close on what is, after all, an 8 million pixel canvas. During the demo period, I said that the Pro and X versions looked very similar, and I'm not seeing anything here to change my mind by and large. However, looking across matched content from the first half hour of the game, there are some small inconsistencies between the two versions. BioWare has confirmed that it uses the Xbox One X's memory as a cache for meshes and textures, and obviously the X has a 5GB advantage over the Pro here. However, the end result in terms of actual differences is pretty slight. By and large, texture quality is a match. However, there are instances where the X's larger cache can resolve some higher quality artwork, as you can see on this beast's scaly hide here. In describing X enhancements compared to the base Xbox One, BioWare also talks about higher quality shadows. Pro keeps up with X here, but in this cutscene you see a pretty obvious difference. Reduced, that is, missing shadows in the mid-distance on the Sony side. I suspect that this might well be down to streaming differences, and as we saw in the demo, neither version covers itself in glory here. So I came out of the VIP demo period thinking that there's not much to differentiate Anthem on the X and the Pro, and based on final code, there are some small anomalies, but the only persistent change is a slight lowering of clarity on the Pro, something that's all but lost bearing in mind how much of Frostbite's post-process rendering arsenal is put to work on this game. The real differentiator then comes in terms of performance. Pro has a 1080p 30 mode that X does not, and it's very solid, as you'll see a bit later on. Meanwhile, the frame rate gap is closer now between X and Pro than it was during the beta, but there's still the sense that Pro is a touch smoother overall, even if it still has issues of its own, particularly with effects that are intensive on GPU bandwidth. Okay, so let's take a look at how the PS4 Pro and vanilla PS4 hardware compare directly. Owing to Anthem's highly dynamic nature, it's really tough to get a bearing on performance comparisons. I mean, every game session will play out differently. So in order to get the best possible results, we take both consoles simultaneously into the same game instance. True like-for-like footage isn't really possible, of course, but we can get an idea of the lie of the land in performance terms, safe in the knowledge that CPU loads in terms of enemy counts, for example, will be equal. We'll kick off by running PS4 Pro in its 4K output mode stacked up against the base PS4 that by and large operates at 1080p. There is some dynamic resolution in play here on the base unit, and similar to the enhanced consoles, it does seem to deliver between 80 to 100% of Full HD resolution on both axes. First up, let's take a look at basic traversal across the overworld, and the outlook on both base PS4 and the Pro at 4K looks, well, pretty much the same. Very similar indeed, certainly. 30 frames per second is indeed the target, and neither can lock to it consistently. But generating this impressive landscape only sees drops to the high 20s on both systems. Meanwhile, both consoles can struggle when it comes to background streaming, resulting in momentary stutter at certain points of the map. It's not exactly intrusive to the experience, but it does take away from the polish just a little. And it's pretty obvious that it's the standard PS4 that is more heavily impacted here. So Anthem performance isn't actually that bad, right? Based on what we've seen so far, there are some dips below 30, but nothing too untoward, and definitely an improvement in consistency compared to the demo experience. Well, that does appear to be the case, but what is clear is that big explosive effects can cause some issues. The lowest recorded frame rate was on the Pro at 24 FPS, and while PS4 and Pro are both affected by the pyrotechnics, it seems that the base unit gets off just a little bit more lightly. Fort Tarsis, of course, can also cause some problems. But let's rewind just for a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, the Pro also allows for a native 1080p output, and this is achieved by setting the front end of your console to output a Full HD signal. I'm not going to bang on about this, but come on guys and girls, please open up different performance modes within the game. Allow the users to swap between them, and yes, make them cross-platform. Right now there's no similar performance mode on the X. Anyway, as you might expect, 1080p 30 is effectively locked throughout, with just a couple of hiccups I'll talk about in a minute. A really easy test is, Fort Tarsis. The performance dips in 4K mode, just gone. The ultimate test is the cave pool of doom that regular viewers will remember from our Anthem Xbox video. Weirdly, this bizarre pool of cursed water caused Xbox One X to deliver lower performance than the S. Stacking up Pro at 1080p versus the base unit, you can see here that the same area still causes problems for the vanilla PlayStation 4, with frame rates bottoming out at a mere 25 FPS. The worst we actually saw from the base console throughout. Pro at 1080p though, as you can see, it just powers through. So what were the hiccups I talked about earlier then? So yeah, it's all about hitching in traversal through the overworld. Entering new areas seems to cause tiny momentary issues, and even the Pro at 1080p can be affected. You can see it here in free roam mode. Some really bad frame time spikes on the base model, but the Pro, although affected, is significantly lighter. You can see it here again with the same stutter on the base unit, but the Pro gets away with one 83 millisecond frame time spike, just as it did in the previous example. So what's causing this then? Well, I think with a 4.2 teraflop GPU limited to 1080p, you can effectively rule out graphics power as the issue. That leaves us with storage. and CPU as the potential culprits for this stutter, and I'd venture to suggest that it is more likely to be the latter. Moving on, the more intense combat gets, the more the Pro in 4K mode and the base PS4 can start to have issues, but having that option for a 1080p output is just really useful. So I'd struggle to call Pro's 1080p output mode a performance mode as such. It's effectively a trade, resolution for frame rate. It's more of a stability option if you like, and I'm glad it's there because this is the only console iteration of Anthem where I was never really bothered by performance hiccups. It just plays how I expect it should do really. The concept of deploying a 4.2 teraflop GPU to run what is effectively a full HD pixel count and an experience equivalent to the PC version running on medium settings does sound like overkill, mind you, but at least you know that whether it's intense combat with insane pyrotechnics or indeed cave lakes of doom, this mode will crunch through it and not bother you with any dips to performance. It's the best way to play Anthem on console in my opinion, but not necessarily the most visually pleasing. Post-process artifacts and inconsistencies do look a lot more noticeable when you're dealing with chunkier pixels, there's no doubt about it. From a technical perspective then, I'd say there's still work to be done on this game. I'd really like to see a stability mode introduced for the Xbox One X version and possibly the ability for users to tweak how aggressive the dynamic resolution scaler can be. Giving the user choice in this area was introduced into Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, and I thought it was a superb idea. The user could choose between aggressive scaling, standard scaling and full native 4K on Xbox One X. It turned a game that struggled with performance consistency into one that delivered a much more fluid experience. And if Anthem's 1080p output mode on Pro demonstrates anything, it's that the major frame rate drops encountered throughout the game are indeed GPU limitations, which can be overcome. So let's sum everything up then. We've had a PS4 focus for this video, but we are now in the position where we can finalise our opinions on this title. Kicking off with Xbox One, this is at the bottom of the pile by some distance, and it is my least favourite version. Resolution is lower than any other system, bottoming out at 720p and peaking at 900p. It also has easily the worst performance of the lot. Following up behind that, there's the PlayStation 4 edition. It may be in third place here, but man, the improvement over S is pretty profound. It's by no means flawless, but it's a perfectly acceptable way to play the game. In the final analysis, X and Pro offer up very similar experiences when both are in their 4K modes. X has a very slight visual advantage, but Pro does seem to be a little bit smoother, with a small boost to frame rates and fewer deviations from the target 30 frames per second. I wouldn't mind playing either, to be honest. They each have their plus and minus points, but Pro's 1080p mode, that's a bit of a bonus extra that's difficult to ignore, especially if you've got a 1080p screen. So there you go, everything you need to know about how the console versions of Anthem stack up. Not quite the cross-platform battle we saw in the demo period, but fascinating nonetheless. Just like the game mechanics, I do think Anthem requires some extra work on the technical side, simply because inconsistent performance in a fast-paced shooter does undoubtedly detract from the experience. But that's where I'm leaving things for now. As always, please do like and subscribe to support our work, and ring the bell for instant notifications whenever a new video drops. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.